Think about something you wanted badly, something you worked toward, waited for, arranged your life around, and then got. How long did the satisfaction last? A day, a week, a month at most, and then, quietly, without drama, the wanting started again. A new version of the same hunger, a slightly different object for the same restless reaching. As if the getting had never quite happened, or had happened, and immediately been absorbed into the background of a life that was already looking for the next thing. This will sound like what Alan Watts describes. It sounds like what Marcus Aurelius was practicing. It sounds like what the Buddhist concept of non-attachment has been pointing at for 2,500 years. The convergence is not accidental. Different minds, different traditions, different centuries, all arriving at a similar recognition about the same fundamental human problem. Arthur Schopenhauer watched this pattern in human beings with the attention of a man who found it both fascinating and deeply troubling. And he arrived at a conclusion that most people find uncomfortable the first time they hear it. The problem is not that you haven't found the right thing to want. The problem is the wanting itself. Desire, in Schopenhauer's framework, is not the path to happiness. It is the structure of suffering. And understanding why, really understanding it, might be the most honest thing philosophy has ever offered you. Arthur Schopenhauer was born in Danzig in 1788 and spent most of his life being spectacularly unappreciated. He published his masterwork, The World as Will and Representation, in 1818 at the age of 30, and watched it be almost entirely ignored. He scheduled his lectures at the University of Berlin at the same time as Hegel, the most celebrated philosopher of the era, apparently confident that students would choose him. They did not. He eventually withdrew from academic life and lived alone in Frankfurt for the last decades of his life with his poodle, whom he named Atma, the Sanskrit word for the universal soul. He was not, by most accounts, a pleasant man. He was pessimistic, combative, and possessed of a certainty about his own genius that his contemporary reception did nothing to justify. He died in 1860, having seen almost none of the recognition he believed he deserved. And yet what he wrote was extraordinary, genuinely original, a philosophical system that drew on Kant, on Eastern philosophy, particularly Hindu and Buddhist thought, which Western philosophers of his era largely ignored, and on his own dark and precise observations about what human beings actually are and how they actually suffer. The foundation of Schopenhauer's philosophy is a concept he called the will. Not will in the everyday sense, not willpower or intention or the decision to do something. Something larger and more fundamental than that. The will, for Schopenhauer, is the blind, irrational force that underlies all of existence, the drive that pushes the plant toward the light without knowing why, the impulse that moves the animal to feed and reproduce and survive without any conscious understanding of what it is doing or why, the restless striving that animates every living thing, not toward any goal, not in service of any purpose, simply because striving is what it does, because it cannot stop. And human beings, Schopenhauer argued, are not exempt from this force. We are not standing outside it, directing it with our reason and our intentions. We are expressions of it. Our desires, our ambitions, our hungers, these are not chosen. They arise from the will operating through us, using us as its vehicle, propelling us toward objects and experiences and people not because those things will satisfy us, but because the will requires movement, requires striving, requires the constant forward momentum of wanting something. Schopenhauer described human life as a pendulum swinging between two poles. On one side, suffering. the state of wanting something you do not have, the lack, the hunger, the restless dissatisfaction of desire unfulfilled. This is the dominant state for most people most of the time, the background condition of a life oriented around getting things it does not yet have. On the other side, boredom, the state of having what you wanted and finding that the wanting was more alive than the having, the flatness that settles in after the achievement, the strange emptiness of a life that has temporarily run out of things to reach for. Between these two poles the pendulum swings, suffering when you want and don't have, boredom when you have and no longer want, and the brief moment of satisfaction at the turn of the pendulum, the instant of getting, is so short and so quickly absorbed into the next cycle of wanting that it barely registers as a state at all. This is a dark picture. Schopenhauer did not pretend otherwise. He was one of the most uncompromising pessimists in the history of philosophy, not as a pose, but as a genuine conclusion reached through careful observation. He believed that non-existence was preferable to existence, and that the most honest response to the human condition was something close to compassion, born from the recognition that everyone you encounter is trapped in the same cycle of desire and suffering that you are. But, and this is where Schopenhauer becomes more useful than his reputation as a pure pessimist suggests, he did not believe the pendulum was all there was. He identified several experiences that he considered genuine escapes from the cycle, moments in which the will was temporarily quieted and something else became available. The first and most powerful was aesthetic experience, specifically the experience of great art, music above all, which Schopenhauer considered the most direct expression of the will itself, and therefore paradoxically the most powerful means of temporarily transcending it. In the genuine encounter with great music or great art, the individual self, the wanting, striving, desiring self, temporarily dissolves. The will is not being served or frustrated. It is, for a moment, simply present to something larger than itself. And in that presence, the suffering of desire is suspended. The second escape was compassion, not as a moral duty, but as a perceptual shift, the recognition that the suffering you experience is not unique to you, that the person across from you is trapped in the same cycle, driven by the same blind will, reaching for satisfaction that will arrive briefly and then dissolve into the next wanting. When you genuinely see that, when the recognition moves from intellectual to felt, the self-absorption that suffering requires becomes harder to maintain. The boundaries between your suffering and theirs become less distinct. And in that blurring, something that functions like relief becomes available. The third, and most demanding, was the deliberate denial of the will, the ascetic path. Choosing, consciously and consistently, to not feed the desires that arise, to let them arise and pass without acting on them, to gradually loosen the grip of the wanting by refusing to give it what it reaches for. This was Schopenhauer's most direct engagement with Buddhist and Hindu practice, the recognition that the Eastern traditions had arrived, through entirely different routes, at something very similar to his own diagnosis and a very similar prescription. Schopenhauer is not offering you a simple fix. If his diagnosis is correct, if desire itself is the structure of suffering rather than a problem with specific desires, then the solution cannot be finding better things to want. It has to be a different relationship to wanting altogether. That is uncomfortable. The entire architecture of modern life is built on the premise that wanting is good and getting is better, that the right career, the right relationship, the right body, the right bank balance will produce the satisfaction that the previous version of those things failed to deliver. The economy, the advertising industry, the entire project of self-improvement as it is usually conceived, all of it depends on the belief that the next desire, fulfilled, will finally do what the last one didn't. Schopenhauer is telling you that this belief is not a mistake you keep making. It is the structure of the trap. But notice what he is not saying. He is not saying that nothing matters. He is not saying that achievement is pointless, or that love is an illusion, or that you should stop caring about your life. He is saying something more precise, that the orientation of perpetual reaching, of making the next acquisition or achievement or experience the condition of your contentment, is a game that cannot be won. Not because you are playing it badly, because the game is designed to keep going. The alternative he points toward is not passivity, it is presence. The capacity to be fully in contact with what is actually here, rather than perpetually oriented toward what is not yet here. To find in the current moment, in the music, in genuine connection with another person, in the simple fact of being alive and conscious on a Tuesday afternoon, something that doesn't require the next thing to be complete. Schopenhauer spent his final years in Frankfurt, largely alone, finally beginning to receive some of the recognition he had sought his whole life. Students started reading him. Letters arrived. His work was being discussed. The wanting that had driven him for decades was beginning, late and incompletely, to be answered. There is no record of whether it felt like he expected it to. The next time you find yourself in the familiar state of reaching, of organizing your contentment around the arrival of something that is not yet here, it might be worth remembering what Schopenhauer noticed, not to stop wanting, not to pretend the desire is not there, simply to see it clearly, to recognize the pendulum for what it is, to understand that the wanting and the brief satisfaction and the next wanting are all the same mechanism doing the same thing. And then, in that recognition, to look for what is already here, what does not require the next thing to be complete, what is available now, in this moment, before the pendulum swings again. Schopenhauer called life a business that does not cover its costs. He was not wrong about the suffering. He may have underestimated what becomes possible when you stop expecting it to.